So I think maybe first I should say Tina and I have been in a certain type of collaboration for a while now. Um, we hadn't written poems together until this one, but we've been friends for a long time. And we say that we share the same brain, so it only made sense for us to write a poem together since it's the same brain anyway. It's, our same brain poem. But we wrote this piece, we began our quilt poem project years ago. When Willow Scott, the late Willow Scott, who worked at Birmingham Museum of Art, invited us to write about the quilt exhibition that was up in the museum. And so we spent some time with those quilts and talked about what they meant to us, and we started this poem. So it began as friends sitting together in front of beautiful art, discussing what it made us feel.
And that process was really a lot of fun because Ashley and I just wandered around the exhibit that had all these quilts, and she was writing down lines, and I was writing down lines, and we were thinking about, oh, well, how would we put this together? And at some point, one of us thought of like, oh, we could make it look like a quilt,
Mhm.
and so that we could find a way to stitch stanzas of the poem together between the two of us.
Mhm.
And it was, I guess that's one of the things that I've always really enjoyed about being around other artists is to be in the space, not just to see their art after it's being made, but to be in the room where it's being created. So that was part of the pleasure of it for me was to like I might be writing something down and then look over and see Ashley's like intently looking at this quilt and she's writing down some lines and then we were able to work on that together.
So my younger sister actually makes quilts. She learned it in school, so it wasn't a passed down skill. She learned it and has been doing it since then. So it's now become a new family tradition for us that we receive these quilts as gifts from her. And seeing her make those quilts is quite an experience to see how these unconnected pieces of fabric become unified. And there's not only the connection of thread, but there's love in that quilt. So even though I didn't have a great grandmother's quilt to think about, thinking of my sister creating these things for us just kind of fueled my idea of how important these quilts were. Even reading the history of some of the quilts that we first viewed, imagining how years from now my little sister's quilts will have that lineage was really quite thrilling for me. So,
So my grandmother, who I was named after, her name was Mozelle. She made quilts, and I sleep under her quilts every night. And I remember as a kid being underneath, like where she was quilting, and seeing, just seeing the tip of the needle going down through the fabric and the batting, and then down to through the backing, and then back up. Um, so yeah, like it was really wonderful to see that exhibit of the quilts, and to see, you know, something that she made and that other women made held as art. Um, Often things that women make are not seen in that way. But to see it like that and go, yeah, what I'm sleeping under every night is art. Um, but I also feel, very strongly like the story everyday use that this is art to be used, art to treasure, yes, but to treasure in that you hug up on it at night, and you feel that love that's stitched into it.
so place is always important to me whenever I write poetry because my poems are tied to me specifically. They are part of my heart, my soul, my spirit. And because of that, I have to include the place where I'm from or whatever place that I'm writing about. And so for this poem, it was kind of impossible to not weave in what happened in Alabama, because these quilts, um, I think some of them were from Alabama specifically. So to think that people were alive so many years before we ever were thought of, and we are able to look at, not touch because they were in a museum, but we're able to look at the labor of their hands this many years later. And for me, I really was taken and almost kind of paused by the idea of enslaved people creating this work and that it has survived, just like the memory of slavery is in me. And of course, I never was enslaved, I was not alive at all, but that memory remains. And so the quilt almost became a physical manifestation of that knowledge that I'm connected to that history. So it had to be woven in, pun intended, to the poem.
So place is also very important to me in my poetry as well, particularly landscape and nature. And the one of the things that I found so lovely about the quilts that we were writing about was that so many of them reflected the landscape. Um, like as it was then, like there was the album of the different things that were being grown. Um, there was like I was really taken with one of the crazy quilts, how the stitching looked like the way you would look at a map and see a variety of different um, pieces of property and divide it up by fences, with those like big large stitches that went between each one. So I guess that all of that kind of helped culminate in me to think of as quilts as a landscape, as something that we like draw over us, you know, when we go to sleep each night.
I think I want people to think beyond the idea of a physical quilt and the way that it's a metaphor for who we are on planet Earth. So we are all different pieces of fabric, if you will, and we all have to be sewn together in order to create something useful. Tina talked about useful art. And so I'm hoping, because we talk not only about the physical object, but about the history, and the people, I'm hoping that readers or listeners will consider just the way that they can be more quilt like in their lives, especially now, especially always. I think we need to do a lot more of drawing together, and being useful to each other, just like quilts have always been.
Yeah, I agree with Ashley. I also like I find quilting as an interesting art too because it's taking scraps of things and putting those together and taking things that we often think aren't useful and bringing those together and making something really beautiful out of it. Um, and also like just that act of like bringing the stitch all the way in and out between everything. I think that's a lovely way of thinking about, like in Ashley's section, she was talking about how the quilt is like the United States, right? Thinking about how we need to weave all the parts together. Like there's something that moves through all of us, and that we should hold that dear, and how beautiful that can be. Like none of us needs to be thrown away as scrap. We can all be brought together.
Amen.